whether you are putting a solar panel or you are putting a wind generator or you are transforming a field for sugarcane or you are drilling for petroleum or you are excavating coal. One way or another, there's going to be some sort of effect on the landscape.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast. I'm your host, Andre Made. Renewable energy is one of the great hopes of humankind when it comes to addressing the threat of climate change and some forms of pollution. Thanks to technological advances, it's now become cost-effective enough to compete with non-renewable energy sources. As renewable energy technologies and efficiency continue improving and new innovations emerge, it's hoped that we can make clean energy ubiquitous one day. But as Thomas Sowell said, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. Energy generation is not just about the gases emitted during the generation process. It's also about where energy infrastructure is located, the materials that are mined and transported to build it, the batteries that store energy from non-baseload sources, the waste produced when energy infrastructure needs to be renewed, and, of most relevance to today's discussion, the relative impacts of different forms of energy production on biodiversity. Alexandros Gasparatos is Associate Professor of Sustainability Science at the Institute for Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo and Adjunct Associate Professor at the United Nations University Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability, also in Tokyo. He is an ecological economist interested in, among other things, renewable energy and energy policy. In my conversation with him, he makes clear above all, I think, that the relationship between energy production from both renewable and non-renewable sources and biodiversity is highly complex, and what constitutes best solutions can be context dependent. I started by asking him to outline the different kinds of energy production.
There are multiple different energy production pathways. Maybe the most useful when it comes to discussions about the environment and broader sustainability are renewable energy systems and non-renewable energy systems. So renewable energy systems are those which depend on energy forms that are replenished usually across human lifetime scales. So we're talking about wind energy, solar energy, the geothermal energy, certain forms of bioenergy, and other waste streams, etc. And then there are the non-renewable energy systems based on non-renewable energy sources, usually fossil fuels and possibly nuclear. A lot of the times nuclear sometimes falls in the renewable and the non-renewable depending on the person keeping the statistics. What is important here though is to consider this energy production part as a component of the broader energy system, which contains the production, conversion, delivery, and use of energy. So it is not usually what we are interested in, just the production, just the fuel, just the carrier, but how this is produced, refined, transported, used at the end, because all of these mediate the broader impacts of energy systems, including on biodiversity.
You mentioned bioenergy, and I know that's actually your area of speciality within this field. What is bioenergy?
So bioenergy is one of, let's say, the broadest forms or categories of renewable energy. It contains the usually chemical or biological transformation of biological material, whether that is plant material or it is waste, or is it other forms of organic material through different chemicals and biological processes in order to produce some sort of useful energy, whether it is ethanol for transport or biodiesel or bioelectricity. So it is a very broad category. There is, in the broader bioenergy family of techniques, you have pathways related to, for example, waste from industry. I was working for many years in sugarcane plants in Southern Africa, so they can take different waste streams like the bagasse and co-generate electricity, or you can transform different elements of food crops into liquid fuels for example, ethanol from sugarcane or biodiesel from oil palm. Or you can have also used oil from restaurants that can be transformed into biofuel, biodiesel in this case. You have different types of gasification and burning of plant material for electricity generation. So it's a very, very broad family of renewable energy systems.
Mhm. And then, generally speaking, you can either generate bioenergy through waste or by creating a crop specifically for that purpose, right? Broadly speaking, those are kind of the two ways that you can do it. Is that more or less the right way of thinking about it?
Yes, either. Or it can be multifunctional. For example, you can use different parts of the same crop for different purposes. So you have dedicated crops dedicated to energy that, for example, it can be different sort of trees that you can burn. You can use it also for second generation biofuel development. But also you can have different parts of the same crop. A classic example is sugarcane, where you can use the juice to create sugar, but also you can create ethanol. And you can use the pressed sugarcane, the biomass, for burning for electricity cogeneration. So it is pretty much very broad.
And I know that you have quite a diverse background, but I was wondering, what was it about this particular area that attracted your interest of energy generation and its impacts on biodiversity?
Yes, so this comes at the beginning of my postdoc, 2010, 2011. At that point, the European Union had passed a legislation that was mandating the use of renewable energy fuels in the transport sector. If I remember correctly, it was 10% or 20%, I cannot remember by heart. So there was a lot of discussion whether biofuels for transport purposes in the European Union are a sustainable option or not. And it was phrased that broadly. Is it sustainable or not?
Mhm.
Is it good for the environment or bad for the environment? And as I mentioned, there are so many different approaches, even for transport biofuel that you can provide it, that you can produce it. There are different crops in different parts of the world for different purposes. So it's very broad. So at this point, you had a very strong policy that if you consider the European Union, hundreds of millions of consumers, passing a legislation that was planning to change energy systems quite dramatically at this stage. And there was not very good evidence for certain type of biofuel practices. One of the elements of the European Union legislation at that point was that if member states cannot provide the fuels domestically, they can import it. And some of the parts of the world that were identified as very important or promising or having high potential to provide feedstock or biofuel were Indonesia through oil palm and was sub-Saharan Africa. There were discussions, a big discussions about a crop called jatropha at this stage. So with a lot of my colleagues, we started becoming not skeptical so much on whether biofuels are good or bad, but how the narrative was framed. It was very monodimensional. And when we are talking about these parts of the world where we are having, traditional agrarian systems, you are having intersection with high biodiversity areas, you have, poor rural farmers, dependence on ecosystem services. Also, at the same time, not established market systems. A lot of the market options were not clear. Who are the middlemen? What are going to be the terms and conditions of export? So you were ending up with all sorts of questions that were being lost. So at this stage, we decided with some of my colleagues to start exploring these questions for very specific bioenergy systems in Southern Africa. And we were looking into jatropha biodiesel and sugarcane ethanol. So that was the entry point.
Can I just ask you, so jatropha, I've heard of it before, but probably a lot of people haven't. It's a kind of plant. In fact, that's about all that I know about it. Why that particular plant? In fact, why sugarcane as well? Why were those two identified as particularly promising?
Okay. I will put it on the context of Africa, okay, because in other parts of the world, it might be a little bit different why they were promoted and what they can achieve. So, in the context of Africa, The whole discussion at this point was revolving across the discussion of the conflicts between biofuel production and food security. Because a lot of the biofuel crops used for biofuel production can be also food crops. We're talking about maize, oil palm, soybeans, sugarcane, even though it is not edible, it's a big component of the food industry. So there was all these huge discussions about competition between biofuel production and food security. Soja trofa had the following benefit. It is inedible, so it is generally poisonous to people. It cannot be eaten. But at the same time, it was supposed to be growing on marginal areas. So areas of very low rainfall. So that it was very drought hardy, that it had these certain positive characteristics that made it an ideal candidate at this stage. So it was also when they were starting, when they started promoting, it was around 2005, 2002. It was early 2000s. So there was quite a lot of money circulating around, and risk investments were kind of acceptable. So it was this kind of crop that had these characteristics. It was not domesticated. It was not produced in a commercial scale. So it was a little bit pilot, but it had these positive characteristics, which coupled with the strong signals by the European Union that, look, there's going to be a big biofuel market here. It started creating all these expectations. Okay. And for a region like Africa, for a continent like Africa, not competition with food security, growing on the marginal conditions, high value export crop, so it ticked a lot of the boxes. Again, it had a lot of other problems. It was not tested, so we did not know whether a lot of these promises held true in reality. Sugarcane is a little bit different. So sugarcane was promoted as a fuel, not for the food industry, as a fuel in certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And Malawi is the most classic example of it. A lot of parts of Southern Africa can achieve very high yields, so they have very good environment for growing sugarcane. Now, in countries like Malawi, that is a very poor country, it is landlocked, the price of fuel is really huge, it made sense to produce it domestically. So in a lot of countries in Southern Africa, especially Malawi, that is the classic example of it, the reasons were not so much export, but domestic use. And it's reflected very similar energy security concerns that we could see also in Brazil when they started their big sugarcane production for ethanol in the 70s and the 80s. So it was very different the ways or the reasons that these crops were being promoted. And the other benefit of sugarcane is that it is very versatile as a crop. So you can choose pretty much your market. You can take it to sugar, you can take it to ethanol, you can have a cogeneration through bagasse. So it provides, a bundle of benefits.
So that's a really interesting case study on bioenergy there, I think. Just wanted to kind of zoom out a little bit and ask about energy generation more generally. I guess that the different forms of energy generation vary quite considerably in the amount of space that they require, their sort of immediate footprint on the landscape. And that footprint is going to have different impacts on biodiversity, which is kind of what we are mostly aiming to talk about here. So can you talk a bit about those in situ impacts of the different forms of energy generation relative to each other, and maybe a little bit, across the renewable and non-renewable spectrum as well?
First of all, I will start a little bit by saying it's not just land use, the in situ impacts. You can have all sorts of other impacts related, for example, to pollution. Depending on what agrochemicals you are using or different, let's say, chemical compounds that you might be using for different generators. So there are a lot of in situ impact. Usually land use is the most visible one, but there are others as well. So when we're looking at land use, the different energy, let's say, generation pathways, whether renewable or non-renewable, one way or another, are affecting land. For example, whether you are putting a solar panel or you are putting a wind generator or you are transforming a field for sugarcane or you are drilling for petroleum or you are excavating coal, one way or another, there's going to be some sort of effect on the landscape. For others, bigger, for others, smaller. in my opinion, is much more interesting to see where this land use change takes place. So it's not just the absolute amount. Is okay, are you cutting a forest to do that? Is it in a barren area but that still contains quite a fragile ecosystem? And maybe you're not going to have the land use change effects and the land degradation effects that you might expect compared to transforming grassland or woodland. But at the same time, if the ecosystem is quite fragile and hosts very critical biodiversity, then you start entering all sorts of debates. So when we're looking at the in situ impacts, first of all, there are more than one. It's not just land use. I would say pollution is equally important. Particularly, for example, for pathways, let's say like biofuels that we mentioned. These are commercial plantations that are using large amounts of fertilizers and pesticides that can produce eutrophication, toxicity effects. They can affect quite significantly, actually, ecosystems and human health. Other examples might be maybe not so much for the production side, but for the transformation side. Imagine that you have a coal plant. It's producing so much sulfur and nitrogen oxides that it can start affecting, possibly having significant effects for acidifications, let alone other air pollutants, household maybe tropospheric ozone pollution, particulate matter, up to greenhouse gases that is not in situ, is much more global impact. So this is why I was trying to make the case in the beginning that it's not just where it is being produced, it's the entirety of it. Where it's being produced, where it's being transformed, where it's being used. So this is what we should be looking at. And when you start having this kind of broader look on energy system, a lot of hidden impacts are coming out. And the second important thing is where these things are located. So for example, if you are putting a wind energy generator in a migratory route for birds, it's going to have a much higher biodiversity impact than if you put it somewhere that is not so important for movement of species. And we see this very much. So it's not just land use change, it's also where this land takes place. Another interesting one that is quite overlooked actually is not just the production sites. A lot of these production sites come in place because you have to build roads and you have to build infrastructure. So an energy production system, whether it is a plantation or a wind farm in high altitude in a mountain, or let's say solar panels in the middle of the desert, require infrastructure to be built, whether it is roads, power lines, ports, whatever. And this is something that we're not very good yet at quantifying. We know that these impacts exist. For example, imagine that you start building a lot of roads around a plantation. You are fragmenting the ecosystem even further, and you are making it accessible into greater, let's say, transformation. And we saw that in a lot of the plantations we were working in Southern Africa. So what the plantations were doing, they were building road systems, which was attracting more people in these areas, which had a secondary effect on land clearing for other agricultural activities.
Right.
Or imagine now that you have roads that go to the top of the mountain. I come from Greece, so we have a lot of energy generators, wind energy generators in top of mountains. These are inaccessible. In the past, nobody could go there. Now it's becoming somehow an interesting sightseeing opportunity. So whether you had only people on foot that could go there, now you have car traffic that goes and is disrupting the ecosystem. Or it's making much more easier, for example, for livestock herders to take animals up there to graze. So you're having all of these complicated effects that is beyond how much land this crop takes or this factory takes. Land use goes much more, even the in situ effects.
I know that I remember town planners telling me that a long time ago there was this idea that you could use a road as a way of marking off the boundary of a city, a boundary for development. But actually, as you say, roads attract development. So if you put a road somewhere, you can be almost guaranteed that more development will happen there. So at a macro scale, that can end up in entire new settlements and even new cities in the long run. Just kind of thinking about some very practical examples. I'm not sure which are the best examples to take, but if you compare something like solar power generation with something like coal power generation, I don't know if those are all, perhaps you feel free to choose other examples, but how do they differ in terms of their physical footprint and then these other less visible footprints that need to be considered?
I'm not aware of a study quantifying it perfectly, okay, because there are a lot of things that are taken into consideration. So, for example, when we're talking about solar panels, okay, the solar panels, the material, rare metals, and whatever else needs to be excavated from somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Also, you have to take up the physical space of where you are locating the solar panels, whether it is on a rooftop or is it in a desert area or is it in an agricultural field or whatever else.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have issues related to transmission lines, roads related to infrastructure. Possibly you might also consider issues related to batteries, because you might need to store this electricity, because as we all know, renewable energy production, especially for some sources like wind and solar, can go up and down during the day. So you might need to store it somewhere to use it.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the batteries. The same applies for coal. Okay, you have coal, it needs to be excavated from somewhere, it needs to be transported through roads, it needs to be combusted, and at the end, it is, you have emissions being emitted from the combustion in thermoelectric plants. So we're talking about two very different things here. If you ask me, I'm very skeptical when I start entering this kind of monodimensional comparisons. Land use is one thing. Okay, usually, if you see just the land use required by the solar panels compared maybe to a thermoelectric plant, might be higher for the amount needed. But what is really important and very interesting that few publications are coming out, but a few have come out in the past years is, okay, where are all these materials coming out for, let's say, solar panels and batteries? And it's very difficult to quantify these things. There are studies that found a big overlapping of mining areas with global biodiversity hotspots. So there was a very interesting study that was published by Somter et al., if I remember correctly, a couple of years ago in Nature Communications that tries to move the debate towards that direction. And what happens if, let's say, deep sea mining becomes a reality? There is a very big discussion that, okay, a lot of these rare materials might be at the bottoms of the oceans, but we do not know much about, deep sea ecosystems. We do not know much less what if a mining activity can affect them. So there are a lot of unknowns at this stage. We should take a much, much broader look when we are looking at. So if you are asking me a question of which one has the biggest, let's say, land requirement, I would say, okay, you have to extend the boundaries towards a full life cycle perspective. But again, this is a discussion that is quite difficult to answer, because then it depends on the type of ecosystems you are affecting. What if, let's say, the power plant, the coal plant is located in an area of, let's say, low biodiversity importance, and the mining field that is bringing out the rare elements or the material needed for a solar panel, it is in the Congo, in Central Africa. That is one of the biggest biodiversity hotspots, or it is coming from deep sea ecosystems that we barely know how they operate. So I think sometimes, and this is why I'm a little bit concerned when we're trying, and this is the reason that I embarked in this research back in 2011, because when we try to simplify these questions like that, we're starting mixing all these other elements of the questions that are making it definitely more complicated, but also more important to consider.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So it is really just an inherently very complex process with a huge number of variables. I guess that, what a policymaker might ask in a case like this is, so which form of energy generation has the greatest potential to be biodiversity friendly? if the mining was sourced in the best way possible, and if the actual place was located in the best place possible. And I guess the technology plays a very important role here, because things are developing, things are not static, right? They're not the same as they were 10 or 20 years ago.
Let me give you a little bit, a more philosophical approach towards that, because we have spent quite a bit of time thinking about it. One of the most important aspects when it comes to biodiversity impacts is the scale. Okay, usually both renewable energy pathways and non-renewable energy pathways have local biodiversity impacts. It can be argued that maybe renewable energy pathways might have more or equal, or we do not know, depending on the situation. It's not trivial. Now, the scale of which most of the negative impacts of non-renewable energy manifest is through greenhouse gas emissions and climate change.
Mm-hmm.
So what you are seeing is that a big scale mismatch. So a lot of the negative biodiversity impacts of, let's say, biodiversity is coming at the local level, while of non-renewable energy at the global level.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're having these very big scale mismatches that is complicating quite a lot the picture.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I would not say that non-renewable energy does not have local biodiversity impacts. Definitely has. Whether we're talking about mines, companies, plants, you can have pollution from, let's say, oil spills. So you can have all sorts of local biodiversity impacts. But arguably, most of the negative biodiversity impacts might be coming from climate change. Now, these two things are very difficult to reconcile. To create studies that, on the one hand, try to bring these two together is extremely difficult. I mean, I have not seen any that make a very convincing argument, because they're requiring totally different modeling approaches for the one system compared to the other system. And the one is a global scale effect, so it's a little bit easier maybe to model, assuming that we know the links between climate change and biodiversity loss, assuming that it's a little bit easier to model certain elements. The other, it is so disaggregated, the renewable energy system, that the impacts in one country or one part of the country might be totally different from another. So we have inherently very, very huge difficulties reconciling this, because the impacts manifest in different scales. Okay, and every time that we start to try to start doing a study like that, we're hitting this type of scale mismatches. So this is the first thing. The second thing here is that biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation are both legitimate policy objectives that are really important for the sustainability of the planet. So you know that while you're promoting renewable energy generation, you are reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is having a positive biodiversity outcome due to reduced greenhouse gas emissions. On the other hand, you are allowing for certain local level impacts. This is creating, I read it in a nice publication, it's called a green dilemma. When you are having climate change mitigation on its own, it's important policy target. Biodiversity conservation, important policy targets. You see elements of these targets throughout multiple SDGs, but in reality, you're bound to have some trade-offs. My approach when I try to deal with these issues, whether it is conceptually or empirically, it is, okay, we're going to have some positive impacts, some negative impacts. Let's try to capture them as best as possible and try to make a decision about it. I have a feeling that a lot of these impacts are very context specific. So, for example, they might be totally different in Japan compared to the US, compared to Sub-Saharan Africa, compared to wherever. So again, I don't think I answered your question, because it is so complicated, the way that is being looked. But I think it is important for us to identify that one of these regions of complication is the scale mismatches. And what I noticed when we were writing an opinion piece a few years ago is that, interestingly, these two, let's say, communities, academic communities, renewable energy, so greenhouse gas emissions mitigation, and biodiversity conservation, rarely meet. it's very interesting to see very few publications trying to deal with this type of issue. There are, different reasons possibly for that, but this is something that it was very striking to me when I was writing this opinion piece that I mentioned last year.
And I guess that similarly with policymakers, in most cases their priority is going to be climate related because it's so much more high profile. And very often a policymaker who deals with climate change might have very little idea about biodiversity. So I guess that what you would like to see is policymakers just understanding the full picture, right? So that even if they're going to be pushing renewable energy, they also need to take biodiversity into consideration. And that might be a simple case of just locating a solar farm or a wind turbine in a particular place rather than another place, right? Could be as simple as that, although it could be a lot more complex as well, I guess.
So these are two environmental objectives. There are other objectives usually that policymakers take into consideration that are very important, equally important. For example, energy security. You might have a country, let's put it like Japan, that is highly industrialized and it is depending on foreign energy imports. So for the Japanese policymaker, maybe energy security is extremely important. For example, in the European Union, there was a lot of huge discussion about employment generation and green jobs. So that can be another policy consideration. In Southern Africa, where we're working, a lot of these biofuel projects were being promoted as a mechanism of rural development and poverty alleviation. That might be another objective. So again, these are two very important environmental objectives that are usually not only having trade-offs between them, but they're having trade-offs with all of other socioeconomic, objectives that might be out there. So actually, the picture is quite more complicated. We are focusing on the environmental side right now, but there are also all other considerations that the policymaker might take into consideration.
Back a little bit to the footprint aspect. I think it's just another interesting element of renewables versus non-renewables, very broadly speaking, is that many renewables, thinking of specifically solar and wind here, take a fairly large area, but their impact is not necessarily as complete or as intense as some non-renewable energy generation. So thinking about a wind farm, for example, they're spaced very far apart, but between them, they might cause problems for migratory bird pathways, but not so much for biodiversity on the ground. Whereas a coal-fired power plant would have a smaller footprint, but it would be absolutely complete, right? It's just concrete.
You're right that there can be different configurations and operational characteristics of, let's say, renewable energy systems that might be biodiversity friendly. For example, you might do spacing. As you mentioned, you might decide to affect the, let's say, operational characteristics of some renewable energy pathways, like the speed of the rotors, or there are things that you can do to enhance. But at the same time, whether we like it or not, I mean, it's huge transformation of the landscape. I brought the example of obviously biofuels earlier, but another example is large hydro. You might actually flood huge areas that might have important biodiversity values. So again, it has to go technology by technology. There are always good practices, that you can install. For example, in some hydro plants, you can have migration corridors for fish to go upstream, or you might use, let's say, smaller hydro plants. You might decide, to move towards offshore wind. That is creating boundaries for shipping in areas, so they are becoming, a little bit off ground for shipping. There are also some renewable energy pathways can have positive biodiversity outcomes directly. Some interesting examples is, for example, you might see biodiversity increases in the foundations of offshore wind turbines. You might have, in some cases, there have been, for example, creation of habitat by hydro. So, for example, there are examples of of creation of smaller islands, which created good habitats for certain animals to avoid predation. So it's getting, so context specific, this thing. So this is
Mm.
why trying to put always the discussion, okay, give me the renewable energy pathway, the location of where you are thinking, and what is the alternative. If we try to make a very, very general prediction of this has high footprint, this has low footprint, it is part of the discussion. Because you can build in both all sorts of other mitigation technologies
Mm.
that might reduce the footprint in the end.
Just speaking of technology, as far as you're aware, has technology kind of improved the ability to make energy generation, especially renewable energy generation, more biodiversity friendly? I mean, I guess things like just efficiency of a given area of solar panel must be having that effect, right? But I don't know if you know of any other examples.
Okay, without being an expert here, I have a feeling usually these discussions are coming through cost. So at this stage, cost of energy generation from renewables has been much more important. And so when you're seeing all this discussion of, let's say, increasing the efficiency of energy generation from renewable energy, is usually associated with cost reduction to make it more appealing.
Mm.
So personally, I have not seen very much from this angle.
Mm.
However, I'm sure that if you can increase the efficiency and you require less space, it's going to be better.
Mm.
Assuming that you are keep constant the amount of space that you want.
Mm.
I'll mention some other biodiversity, friendly features that can be used. You can start thinking, let's say, I mentioned the example of hydropower using certain elements to to allow fish to migrate, or thinking the possibility of adjusting the speed of the rotors or not putting them in specific areas. There are all sorts of considerations that can be taken consideration.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I will go back that all of these require quite a lot of integrated thinking. There are a few studies that are coming out. One off the top of my head that's coming out that is trying to take into consideration all these cost elements and renewable energy pathways and shift to renewable energy. For example, there have been some very nice studies by the Nature Conservancy
Mm-hmm.
for California. They try to take this kind of integrated approach, and it is one of the better approaches that I have seen when it comes to that, because what they have tried to do through these types of studies, they try to bring together different stakeholders from the power industries, policymakers, conservationists. So they're creating these very interesting and multidimensional energy profiles, which at the end, I do not know how they're being used or if they're going to be used. It boils down, the more that I read them, to some sort of decision of which trade-offs are acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
There might be win-win up to a degree, but there is bound to be some trade-off somewhere. Especially if you start taking, the more that you increase, let's say, the boundaries of your study, the more likely you're to hit a trade-off, in my opinion. So there are studies that are trying to take this kind of considerations that you are bringing off, things like which kind of energy production pathway can be sustainable, taking into consideration multiple dimensions. So there are some good examples.
I was just kind of imagining you having the opportunity to share a fairly long elevator ride with a policymaker who's on their way to make a policy decision about which form of energy generation to consider. I guess in a sense, I'm asking you to kind of summarize everything that you've mentioned in this discussion already. But if you had that opportunity to just very briefly tell them what's important to consider, what would you focus on?
Well, context matters, but for example, you can make these studies at the national level. So I have a feeling that it is possible to do these modeling studies at a level that you can offer very good information to policymakers to show that these trade-offs exist and eventually it's becoming some sort of political decision, or it's becoming a decision at least informed by very good quality data. So I'm not negative in the sense that we are not going to be able to provide good information. I'm just saying that this can be done at the national level. I don't believe that globally applicable solution might exist because countries have different economic systems, different development aspirations, different agroecological zones, ecosystems. So this is where I'm coming from. And I believe that at the national level, it is highly possible to create these exercises that can explore energy futures, reducing impact on the environment while taking in consideration certain socioeconomic goals. So I'm positive that this can happen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what I will stress to stakeholders is that there might not be necessarily a one-size-fits-all answer. That trade-offs will happen. Win-win situations might exist in certain contexts, but we might not always expect to find a win-win situation. So we should be very clear on how we are trading off our decisions.
Mm.
We're going to definitely have a negative effect on the environment if we stick to conventional fossil fuels for energy production. We will have a reduced, most likely, impact on biodiversity if we promote aggressively renewable energy, but we do not know necessarily that we're going to avoid totally this negative effect. And this is very important to convey to stakeholders. Now, how this can be done? You can try to find ways to do it, and this will depend again in the national context you're working. For example, you can try to have a very easy message that is, let's say, ruminated by multiple iterations of your research, or you can try to have a very disaggregated and complicated view to allow the decision makers to appreciate the underlying data. This again is coming now to our engagement as researchers in policy relevant questions. Again, the context there, as you might know very well, matters. So the context that I usually have worked, it's much more towards awareness raising. So I cannot comment so much about decision making. I can comment on awareness raising.
Mm-hmm.
So what I have found in this context of awareness raising, we have worked with different stakeholders. Let's say in the context that I worked in Southern Africa, these stakeholders want clear evidence that this happens is positive, this happens is negative. If you do this, this is going to be the causal pathway to go beyond, let's say, basic of, let's say, expectations or something that looks very, straightforward, to show the clear causalities. And that can happen also on the socioeconomic end, because, for example, a lot of the times that we were working in Southern Africa, okay, you're having a sugarcane plantation there, great. You might not want to expand, not to affect biodiversity negatively, but what will happen if you do not expand and you lose the competitiveness of this plantation, and the plantation goes down, collapses, and you have converted anyway a huge amount of land, and you are losing the local jobs, that is highly likely that they might switch towards other forms of agriculture, opening new land, or relying on other ecosystem services. So there are a lot and unanticipated trade-offs if you start playing, through this mindset. And I found that playing games sometimes with stakeholders when we are raising awareness, it helps them a lot, but also helps us a lot to understand what might be these trade-offs. For example, this came, what I'm telling you, from one of the executives of, let's say, of a sugarcane company we were working with. We were having a big workshop in one of our study countries and say, but if we do not expand, we're dead. We cannot compete. So basically, what is going to happen? We're going to collapse. 10,000 people, 20,000 people are going to lose land. Now, this land, how it's going to be transferred? Very complicated. How many years it might take to go to something that's productive? What are these people going to do? Most likely, they're going to turn to livestock rearing. They're going to turn to other forms of agriculture. So it's creating all these kind of interesting trade-offs that, sitting down with other stakeholders can become obvious to you, especially if you're coming solely from the environment field.
And when you say you're playing a game, is there some kind of visual aspect to the game? I'm just thinking about exactly what you do.
So, for example, we have started with presentations of our research findings, and with the levels of certainty. Like for this, we're quite certain. For this, it's not very certain. This, we see it happening, but we do not know which way it goes. The causality. In the case of sugarcane that we were working in Southern Africa. And then you start creating mental, let's put it, situations. Okay, what if 50% of what if the plantation increased by 50% in size over the last 5 years? What if international prices went up and the plantation became uncompetitive and had to close down? So we were putting them through this type of scenarios, and we're trying to see, in their opinion, which way the impacts will go. Instead of designing the scenarios with the stakeholders, we have designed it on our own. We confront them with the scenarios and they tell us what they think will happen in this case, subject to a lot of the new evidence that we provided them. And that is very useful for us to understand trade-offs that we never saw when we're doing the analysis. We've done it 4 or 5 times and it was quite valuable actually, to raise awareness, but also for us to find unanticipated trade-offs that we never thought might exist.
As Alexandros and I hinted in this episode, there seems to be scope to return to some forms of energy production in the future to dig deeper into their pros and cons. So I'll see if I can track down experts in particular areas like solar and wind, for example. But for next time, I'll be getting a bit more philosophical. I invited Tim Hoffman, a professor and mentor of mine, to address the subject of being open-minded in our discipline and in science more generally. Tim specializes in how land use practices, particularly over the last 100 years, have impacted on biodiversity and landscapes. And he has some fascinating ways of doing the ecological detective work behind this. I've always considered him one of the most humble and open-minded intellectuals that I know, and we'll be digging into how his work, including his work with indigenous and local communities, has affected his outlook.